Christ. Amen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Will, one of the pastors here at New Life Pres, and it's good to see you all here today worshiping the Lord. We are continuing along in the middle of a series in the story of Joseph, and today our passage comes to us in Genesis chapter 42. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up with me to Genesis 42. I'll be reading the entire chapter, which is a fairly lengthy passage, but as I do this, just be reminded that it is God's word and His Spirit that speaks to us. So if you're able, I want to ask you to stand for the reading of His word. We do this here at New Life Pres as just an act of worship, as a sign of reverence for God's holy word. And I read once that actually in the Old Testament, the Israelites would worship and their sermons were about all day sometimes, and then they would stand for the entire sermon. So I think for a 5-minute reading passage, it's not too bad. But I'll be reading starting with verse 1, Genesis chapter 42. When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. They said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. And he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." They said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." He said to them, "No, it is the nakedness of this land that you have come to see." And they said, "We, your servants, are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more." When Joseph said to them, "It is as I said to you, you are spies, but this you shall be tested. By this you shall be tested by the life of Pharaoh. You shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you and let him bring your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh surely you are spies." And he put them all together in custody for 3 days. On the 3rd day Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households. And bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die." And they did so. Then they said to one another, "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. This is why this distress has come upon us." And Reuben answered them, Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy, but you did not listen? So now there comes a reckoning for his blood." They did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. Then he turned away from them and wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them, and he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to replace every man's money in his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. This was done for them. Then they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed. And as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money in the mouth of his sack. And he said to his brothers, "My money has been put back. Here it is in the mouth of my sack." At this their hearts failed them, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this God has done to us?" And when they came to Jacob, their father in the land of Canaan, they told him all that happened to them, saying, "The man, the Lord of the land, spoke roughly to us and took us to be spies of the land. But we said to him, 'We are honest men. We have never been spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more, and the youngest is this day with our father in the land of Canaan.' Then the man, the Lord of the land, said to us, 'By this I shall know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me and take grain for the famine of your households and go your way. Bring your youngest brother to me, then I shall know that you are not spies but honest men, and I will deliver your brother to you, and you shall trade in the land.' As they emptied their sacks, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob their father said to them, 'You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you would take Benjamin. All this has come against me.' Then Reuben said to his father, 'Kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I'll bring him back to you.' But he said, My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he's only one left. If harm should happen to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol. And this is God's word for us here today. Please take your seats. Friends, if you've been with us for the past handful of weeks as we began the story of Joseph back in chapter 37, you would know that actually the Joseph story is both a story big, but also a story small. And what I mean by this is that it's a story big in the sense that the Joseph story in Genesis really is a way to tell some of the most significant and grand theological truths that move God's plan for salvation forward. It's really big, it's grand, it covers a wide range in terms of number of years, and it's significant in its theological contribution. It's really a story that has big theological significant truths. And in particular, it shows us two things. One, how did the Israelites end up in Egypt? Because that sets the next stage of the story with Exodus and Moses. And secondly, it shows us how did God keep his promises to his covenant with Abraham so that his family was preserved. So back in Genesis 12, that God could fulfill the promises to Abraham, say, you will inherit a big land, and that your family, that you will be a father of many nations, that ultimately we know is fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and that Abraham's family is ultimately fulfilled in the seed, not just with Jewish people, but really people of all nations, tribes, and tongues. And so it really is a story big, that Abraham is a father of all nations, and that's why he truly is Father Abraham, who had many sons, and many sons in Jesus Christ had Father Abraham. But we also know that the story of Joseph is a story small. And by a story small, I'm saying that these are real people, real characters that are broken just like you and me, and they're so relatable. We understand them, we could resonate with them, we feel that they are living our life experiences. And one of the ways we connect with these characters is that Joseph, the main character of the story, is really a man who needs a lot of personal healing and reconciliation. There's not much emotion that's described by Joseph up until chapter 42, but he's been hurt by his father, betrayed by his brothers, unjustly accused by Potiphar's wife, and imprisoned unjustly for 13 years. He finally gets out. He's a man who's forgotten by the cupbearer. So there's a lot of hurt, a lot of pain, a lot of personal reconciliation that he also needs with his brothers. But it also shows that families are broken, that we have favoritism within the family. There's idols with our children, idols with parents' approval. Within the family, we see that not only are relationships strained and brothers don't get along, but in order for God's promises to move forward, the family has to stay intact. So it really is a lesson about family reconciliation, sibling rivalry, parenting, how to understand as a child that you live out of the approval of God and not for the approval of your dad. And so there's a lot of stories within the grand story that is really small. And I want to talk about that here today, the story small, because we have here in the beginning of Genesis 42, really a picture finally of Joseph's healing and personal reconciliation. Now, how does he deal with his brothers? How does he show a little bit, an ounce of emotion? How does he show his pain and hurt? And we begin to see the 10 brothers have a moment of growth, a moment of character change, that they begin to grow and heal and want to really be reconciled with their younger brother who they betrayed. So it's a story of renewal and reconciliation, which is our theme for this year. And when we look at Genesis 42, there are three things about this deep character change in the brothers that we can recognize, we can resonate with. That three things about this character change that we see can apply to your life and story as well. First, we see that character change comes through a test. Secondly, real change begins with an honest admission of your sin. And thirdly, real change is confirmed, is validated, is seen in transformation. So I want to ask you, how do you know that you're really changing? Do you want to change for the better? And how do you know and how do you get about changing in your life for the better? So we'll see that it comes through a test, it begins with an admission, and it's verified, validated, seen through a real gospel transformation in the brothers. So let's look at this. The first characteristic of change is that it begins and comes actually through a test. Verse 1 says this: When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" Now you have to think about this. It's a life and death situation. It's where essentially everyone is desperate for food. And there's 10 brothers. Jacob, their dad, comes in and says to the 10 brothers, his 10 sons, why are you just standing around looking at each other, clueless, and as if you have no idea what you got to do? Now, I can relate to Jacob on a smaller scale because there was a time when one of my daughters spilled a cup of water, and she spilled this water. The water was flowing out of the cup onto our laminate flooring. But for some reason, my younger daughter, Reese, just stood there and was unable to move, just looked at the cup that was spilling all over the place. And in my sin and frustration, I yelled at her and I said, Reese, why are you just standing there? Pick up the cup. That's how it feels like. That's what Jacob is doing. He's basically going to his sons and saying, grain is flowing out of Canaan and Egypt and all the land. Do something. Why are you just standing there? Why are you just looking at each other? And so he tells them, go to Egypt, talk to the vizier, the prime minister, Pharaoh, see if you could buy some grain. For goodness sakes, do something with your lives. And so they go and they take a trip over to Egypt. They see the vizier, the prime minister, who is Joseph. They went there to buy some grain. And when they get there, Joseph immediately recognizes who they are. But the brothers don't recognize who Joseph is. I mean, after all, it's been 20 years. Joseph at this point is shaven. He's not culturally what maybe ancient Near Eastern cultures did, where they grew beards and long hair. He was probably clean shaven. He was wearing royal political clothing and power. They didn't expect to see the brother that they betrayed to be in a position of authority. It's been 20 years. So some skeptics say there's no way the brothers did not recognize Joseph. But 20 years, their voice changes a lot. He went from 17 to 30 years old. So definitely they didn't recognize him. By the way, I remember some of you will look at a sermon that I preached when I first came to New Life in 2011. You can see it back on YouTube, and people are saying, Pastor Will looks so different. He almost looks like an entirely different person. And that's only been about 9 years. This has been 17 years. He's utterly changed and he's different. The relationship is couched in a different context. And in verse 7, Joseph says, what we read here, Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Now, he spoke harshly. That word roughly means he said some really harsh things. And I wish there was more detail. I wondered what he said. But at least we know that he begins to accuse them, saying, who are you guys? You guys are spies. He says it 4 times in the passage. He speaks rough things to them. Now, there's difference of opinions as to why Joseph said rough things to them and spoke harshly. Now, the common sense is that Joseph is hurt, he's spiteful, he's bitter, he's vengeful, so he begins to get some payback. There's revenge here. The other actual theory about this, which I agree with, is that Joseph is developing a plan to test his brothers. In fact, Joseph says they're spies. They say we're honest men, which is ironic because they're not very honest if they knew that Joseph was talking to them, the person that they threw and betrayed into the cistern and traded. He says, we're honest men, and Joseph says, no, you definitely are spies. And he says, no, we're 12 brothers. The youngest is back with our dad in Canaan. The other one is no more. Now think about that for a second. They don't even name actually Joseph. They said there are 12 brothers. The youngest one is back with dad. And there's one is no more. His name is no more. Now Joseph is seeing this. He didn't expect it. He's hurt. There's a lot of bitterness. We see later that he weeps. He has to move away a couple of times to cry. It's a moment of catharsis, emotional release. What would you do? You see the brothers that's betrayed you. There's a tension. There's a confusion. But Joseph here, I don't think he's trying to punish them. I don't think he's trying to be bitter and spiteful. I think in the godliness of his character, he wants to test them to see if they really changed. Verse 15 says so. It says there in verse 15, let me test you. So he puts them to a test. That word test there has a reference in other parts of the Old Testament to silver and bronze and precious metals. So in Jeremiah 6, Jeremiah sent to people who were bronze and silver to test them. And then also in Psalm 66:10, this is talking about the wilderness wandering. The psalmist says, for you, O God, have tested us. You have tried us as silver is tried. In other words, the word test there means finding out or determining the worth or value of something. And Joseph, in his cool, calm, collected state, he's presented as a discerning wise man full of emotion and hurt, is able to overcome this. And he sees his brothers and says, I wonder if they really changed. And he begins to test them. And he tests them by speaking harsh words to jar them and to shake them so that hopefully they can own up to their sin and their betrayal. I think that's what's going on in this passage. Part of why Joseph is harsh and speaks roughly is because he's developing a plan to test the sincerity of the character of his brothers. Friends, either way you imagine emotions welling up inside of Joseph. It takes supernatural strength to have emotional restraint so that Joseph, on the one hand, doesn't lambaste his brothers, and Joseph, on the other hand, doesn't break down in bitter tears and heartache and sorrow. Supernatural strength, and he begins to test them, develop and plan in the moment. Friends, maybe it's just going to speak to a couple of you here, but isn't it true that some of you may have a falling out with a family member, a child, your spouse, a good friend, who have brought a lot of deep hurt and pain, and you're just hoping and waiting for that person just to acknowledge your pain and hurt and what they said to you? Have you ever had a moment? Is it just me? Have you ever had a moment where you just really would wish to have a moment of healing because you need someone to actually own what they did to you and said to you so that you could begin a process of healing? Have you had a moment like this? That's Joseph. Maybe he had rage and anger building up. Maybe it was tears and hurt, probably all of the above. But in his wisdom, because if you remember, the Spirit of God is on top of him, he was able to develop a plan in the moment to test him. And here's the key thing for me, verses 8 to 9, where Moses links the harsh words that Joseph says back to Joseph's dreams in 37. One of the dreams in 37 was that Joseph had a dream where the binding sheaves, which represented the brothers, were all bowing down to him. Now, this means that if the family bowed down to Joseph as ruler, it assumes that there is some level of healing, processing, reconciliation, and real change, because the brothers wouldn't bow down and kneel to their youngest brother Joseph unless there's some healing and change. So I think for me, that was key, that what Joseph here is doing is not vengeful or spiteful, but actually is a way to test their character. The one commentator says, harsh words are part of the developing plan to test his brothers. Joseph can't trust himself to his brothers until he knows that their character is trustworthy. He wanted to see if they really changed. Friends, Joseph is never pictured here, painted by the author Moses as being bitter and vindictive. He's presented as the wise man, the man with a plan. Getting even in Proverbs was never what the wise man does. Being vengeful and getting revenge and making the score even was never a character of a wise man, but actually to test the character of somebody like Joseph does is indication that Joseph was wise in testing him. Even in verse 24, Joseph weeps and he cries when he finally begins to process. He doesn't gloat, he doesn't brag, he doesn't throw his power around. He has to move away and he has to process because he finally sees that his family recognizes the pain and hurt that they instilled upon Joseph. And it's a moment where he couldn't hold down his tears anymore. So he runs away and he cries and he weeps. Full of heartache is a very strong word there in 24. And this is Joseph's plan. Part of being harsh to them is to break them so they can confess their sin. But he's so savvy here. Joseph's plan is that he eventually sends 9 brothers back to their dad Jacob and asks them to bring Benjamin back to Joseph, so then if they do this, he'll know that they're honest people. Now, the plan's a little bit weird because how does that prove that they're honest? And this is what Joseph really does. This is the confusing point. He puts their money back into their sacks. Now, commentators are thinking, well, this is because Joseph is gracious, he's magnanimous, he's loving, so he gives them free food and grain, and then he also gives them their money back. It might be a little bit about this, but I think it's more that Joseph is putting the money back as a way to test their character. Why is that? Because the brothers, if they're still dishonest, could take the money, lie about actually Simeon, go back to Jacob and say, Dad, we actually lost our brother against Simeon. We don't know where he is, and they don't have to tell Jacob that they also got their money back. The reason you think they could do that It's because that's exactly what they did to Joseph back in chapter 37. They came to Jacob, they lied about what happened to their younger brother, and they sold him for 20 shekels, and they didn't tell their dad that they had money. So Joseph is saying, I'm going to put you in the same exact position, put money back in, and I'm going to see if you're going to sell your younger brother Simeon or your older brother Simeon and commit the very same sin for money. It's a very savvy move. He forces the brothers to face their past so that when in the past they valued silver more than Joseph's life, and he's wondering and testing them again, will they value silver again over the life of Simeon? Because they easily could have taken the money and lied to their dad once again. Plus, Jacob is about 20 years older at this point. He's not as mentally sharp, most likely. Joseph will see what they do. That's why change came through this test. Bruce Walke, the commentator, summarizes my first point eloquently in this way, and he writes this. In the final analysis, whatever his motives, Joseph's interactions with his brothers under the good hand of God mark an important transformation in the brothers' characters, from being untrustworthy to trustworthy, and in their relationships from dysfunctional to functional. This marks the beginning of real character change that came through a test with his brothers, from being dysfunctional to functional, to proving and testing that they were untrustworthy to growing and now being trustworthy, all through this wise and savvy plan that Joseph implemented in the moment when he had emotional rage and tears to his brothers. He implements this plan. And this brings us to our second point. Real change begins, at least in our story, with an admission of your sin. Friends, this is what I mean. Real change in your life, real change in my life, in people's lives, comes with an honest recognition as well as a heartfelt admission of one's sin. And this is where it gets deep. It's one thing to know your sin. It's another thing to own your sin. Joseph's brothers knew that actually kidnapping the brother and selling Joseph into slavery was bad. They knew their sin, but they didn't own their sin. Many of you know your sin, but many of you may not own your sin. The difference of owning your sin is that you feel repentant. You have a view to God's holiness. You look to how you should live in light of the Bible. You want to be Christ-like in your character and conduct. Many of you know when you're being manipulative. You know when you actually are gossiping. You know when you're lustful. You know when you're greedy. You know when you manipulated somebody for power. Many of you know your sin, but there's a difference between knowing your sin and owning your sin. There's a difference between recognizing what you've done wrong and confessing to God, a holy God, that you actually did wrong. And here, for real change, friends, for you and me and what we see in the brothers, real change has to begin not just with knowing your sin, but also owning your sin. You have to own it and admit it and confess it. Now, one of the biggest sins that we look at in Psalm 51 is actually the sin of King David and Bathsheba. David, he manipulated, he was empowered, there was oppression. He took Bathsheba for himself physically out of his lust. He actually set up so that the husband Uriah was sent out into battle. He knew everything that was wrong. He knew his sin, but he never owned it until God spoke winsomely through Nathan. And when he told this little story to show King David his sin, it was in that moment where his eyes were opened up and he saw that essentially he broke every one of the 10 commandments. Friends, we may need a moment like this too, because if you don't have a moment like David does, and then won't have a moment like the brothers do, you'll never actually have any change. Because you can't just know what sin is, you got to own it. You have to feel it. You have to have godly sorrow that leads to repentance. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10. So in verse 21, we see the brothers begin to own their sin. Then they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother. They finally own it. We first see it in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. And finally, in verse 21, they own their sin, but we finally see that Joseph just didn't go quietly, but he was begging for his life. Imagine the younger brother being confused, wearing this colorful coat, being thrown down into the cistern and then traded as a slave. You can imagine what Joseph was doing desperately, yelling out in desperation, why are you guys doing this? Let me stay. Don't do this to me. Just a little bit longer. Wait a moment. Let's talk about this. That's the distress that we see in verse 21. But the brothers were so callous, it was easy for them because if you remember in 37, they threw him into the cistern, and what did they do? They sat down and had lunch. That was the callousness of their hearts. That was the hardness of their hearts. And Joseph is listening to the brothers talking over this, And he may be thinking, are they really repentant here? Do they really change? Or is this just a momentary experience of stress and sadness, and they'll continue along in their selfish ways? That's what Joseph may be thinking. So he begins to figure this out, and he discovers that they really did change, because he's wondering if they really did, and he places them in a test, and he wants to know if they really changed and if that admission in verse 21 was honest and genuine. Derek Kidner, the Old Testament commentator, says this: just how well judged was Joseph's policy can be seen in the growth of quite nude attitudes in the brothers as the alternating sun and frost broke them open to God. Now, this is our lesson for today, friends. This is how you will be able to admit your sin. Derek Kidner is right. He's saying basically Joseph was able to break open his brothers' hearts to the work of God through being frost as well as sun. And I'm going to harbor and I'm going to bank on that analogy a little bit to say the way the brothers were able to admit their sin was through a combination of being frost, exposed to frost and the sun. And that means that's for you too. In other words, this is what I mean. Joseph gives his brothers a mixture of harsh words, but also tender moments of mercy, all wrapped up into one. He gives them the frost, and he also gives them the sun. He gives them harsh reality of their sin, but also he gives them warmth and the grace of a brother showing love. And that's what broke open their hearts. He was harsh to them. You're spies, you're spies. He says it 4 times, but you see there's moments of grace, moments of warmth, moments of sun. Now, this is what we see. There was very much, for Joseph, a frostbitten life to them. There's harsh words. He threw them in jail for 3 days so they could relive their past. He binds Simeon before their eyes when he changes his plans. He accuses them 4 times of being spies, verse 19, 12, 14, and 16. He has a lot of harsh words for them. That's all that we know. He probably said more because the Hebrew word for harsh things, roughly, is harsh things. So he said a lot of words that were cold, that were frostbitten, that made him feel a little bit rigid, that made him feel like, oh man, this is something that sort of paralyzed me. But mixed in and sprinkled throughout this were words of sun. They're imprisoned for only 3 days, whereas Joseph was 13 days. Joseph changes his mind because it originally says, I'm going to keep 9 of you in prison and send 1 back to Jacob. But after 3 days, Joseph changes his mind and says, I'm just going to keep Simeon and I'll send 9 brothers back to Jacob. So it's a little bit more gracious. There's a warmth there. And the reason that he said 9 back, according to one commentator, is because 9 would mean that 9 sons would be able to persuade their dad Jacob. 9 sons would be able to bring more grain back to the family for food. 9 sons coming back would make Jacob's distress a little bit less rather than only having 1 son. So it's presumably that Joseph's even still thinking about his dad. He gives them grain for their journey and gives them money, even though it's a test, as a way that shows his love and grace to his son. This alternating frost and sun, friends, ultimately helps the brothers to change and own their sin and to admit it, as we see in basically verse 21. Friends, you think about this. The brothers heard the cries of their brother Joseph in 37, and it didn't touch their heart. The brothers saw their father Jacob convulsing in tears, and it didn't change their heart. The only thing that changed their heart was this combination of frost and sun, or in more theological terms, law and gospel. Friends, this is our lesson for you today. On the one hand, you have to expose yourself to both winter and to sun. And one way that you can also be sun and winter to people around in this church. Now, this is the application. Some of you are just winter. You're just a freezer, and it's needed. You know, you're rigid, you're clear, you're sort of black and white. You're always judging and criticizing when things are wrong, and you're showing people sin. You're really good at that, and we need that in the church. But one thing is to consider, even when you help people, that you can't just be winter. You can't just be the freezer. You also have to be the sun. In other words, you can't just be the freezer. You also have to be the tanning booth. You actually need both to help people change. But some of you just sit too much in winter. All you do is judge and criticize. All you do is really good at pointing people's sins. On the other hand, some of you, because you have a deep fear of man, maybe like myself, You have a hard time of actually speaking loving truth to people, so you're always like the sun. You're just warm, you're reassuring, you make people feel good, you bask in the sun, it makes them lazy, it makes them feel relaxed, and you just really speak just loving truth and you comfort them. But either way, the passage implies that you have to be both sun and winter because that's what Joseph was to the brothers. You can't just be the cold bitterness of harsh words, but you also can't just be the loving reassurance of warm words. There's a moment and there's a time of both, and Joseph shows that he wraps both up into his brothers that ultimately led them to change. So you have to be like that for other people, and you have to be receptive like that from other people. Some people are going to be your winter. Some people are going to be your summer, and you need both in your life if you really want change. If you always just want summer and you always want the sun, then it's going to make you basically indulgent. It's going to make you clueless. It won't allow you to grow because you always think that you're good. It'll make you self-concentrated, licentious. It'll make you actually think about your personal desires and preferences. But you also can't just be winter and expose yourself to the freezer because then it'll make you bitter. It'll make you guilty. It'll make you feel defeated. You have to open yourself up to both to have clarity on your sin because there's winters in your life, but then also that'll lead you to the warmth of the gospel and the grace of Jesus in the summers of your life. That's what you have to do. That's what Joseph does. In his commentary on the book of Genesis, Martin Luther goes on at length to show that when we act like non-believers, God treats us, his family, like Joseph treats his brothers. See, when you talk about winter and sun, we're essentially talking about is the loving discipline of the Father, according to Hebrews 12, 1 through 15. The Lord disciplines those he loves, just like a father disciplines his children. In childlike discipline, when it's done right, it does have a taste of punishment, has a taste of retribution. But it's different because father love and father-like discipline has ultimately as his goal and motivation not repayment, but rehabilitation. That's what Joseph does to his brother. He tests them. He's not vengeful. He's not trying to repay his brothers for what they did to him. He's trying to test his brothers so they could rehabilitate. In real retribution, the goal is simply punishment and justice, just payback, quid pro quo. Lex talionis, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But that's different. There's a place for real justice where you just have to pay for what you've done. You recompense people for their good deeds, but you punish them for their bad deeds. There's a place for that in our society. But in the family of God, God disciplines us as a loving father so that there's a taste of retribution, according to what Keller has said, but actually the goal is not going to be retribution, but rehabilitation. Rehabilitation basically means that the goal is Christian maturity and it's freedom from bad character. The Father brings just enough pain into our lives, along with the expressions of mercy and love, so the child is moved away from bad habits that can ruin his life and be set on the track to godliness and holiness on the path of righteousness. So friends, your application here is you really want to change. You want to own your sin, not just know your sin. You want to admit your sin, just like verse 21. It means that you have to expose yourself to the winters and the suns of the people in this room. Some of you also have to recognize that you're too much winter. And really to love people and help people, you have to throw a little bit of the tanning booth in there. And some of you just make people bronze. You make them tan. You make them beautiful. You just make them reassured and comforted. But to really help them grow, if you really love them, you got to be a little bit like the freezer. You got to open them up to the winter. You got to throw snow at them and snowballs. You got to be able to speak loving truth so they have clarity on their sin and their lack of holiness. That's how you lead to change. And this is our last point. Real change came through a test. It begins with admission. But real change is seen in transformation. See, the question that we're trying to ask here is that how do you actually verify that somebody really changed? And at the end of the day, it's a slow process, but you can tell real change when people change. They stop doing the same thing. No, it takes time, so they stop committing the same sin with less frequency and less intensity, and ultimately, completely. That's how you know there's real change. Now, you look at this passage towards the end, we see moments of real change. We already saw it in 21 with the brothers. They own their sin. That's real change there. That's a fruit. That's an evidence of real grace and transformation in the brothers. But we can contrast how the brothers came back to their dad Jacob in chapter 42 and compare that to when the brothers came to Jacob, their dad, in the beginning of the story in chapter 37. Chapter 37, remember, the brothers were callous. The cries of their brother didn't change their heart. The tears of the dad didn't change their heart. They loved 20 shekels more than the life of Joseph. They were envious, they were jealous because the youngest brother got the colorful coat, and so they threw him away like a piece of garbage. They go back to Jacob and they see their dad completely being heartbroken, but they lied to him and said, actually, your youngest son, Joseph, was eaten by some sort of animal, completely shrouded in deception. They're changing. How? Because in chapter 42, when they go back to Jacob, they didn't hide the money. They owned the money and said, we don't know why this money is here. It made them distressed. What is God doing to us? They could have lied to their dad, Jacob, and said, we don't know what happened to Simeon. Take the money and hide it from them, Dad. But they completely told the story in truth. Here in verses 29 to 38, they recap as best as they can the story of what just happened to their dad. And they even acknowledge finally that God's hand in verse 28 is in the midst of this. They're changing their ways and their habits. As Derek Kidner says, this is the beginning of quite new attitudes in the growth of their brothers. So friends, this means the way to change, to tell if you're really changing, is to see if there's a transformation in your life. Are you changing in the way that you're being impatient? Are you changing in the way that you have harsh words? Are you changing the way that you use your time? Are you changing the way that you treat a certain person in this room that you don't like? Are you changing the way that you think about money or your job or vocation? Are you changing the way that you think about Sunday service on the Sabbath to publicly worship together consistently at your local church? There's so many everyday moments that the gospel is changing you. Are you changing in the way that the brothers, by the grace of God, through this warmth as well as the winter, have began to change? Can you own your sin? Can you confess it? Can your heart break for it because you broke the holiness of God's character? This is the hope for you. Our change is slow and gradual. You know, the brothers were not perfect. Even in the recounting of the story, they sort of embellished a few things, but it's a lot better than 37. But for us, our hope is that our change, in one sense, is climactic, is heavenly, and is definitive. We have a real breaking of power with death over us that no longer reigns over us, and a breaking of power with the sin that entered in this world in Genesis. Our change here doesn't come through Joseph giving us winter and sun. Our change comes here because Joseph points to the true and better Joseph in Jesus Christ, who gives us the climactic winter and sun. Our change is definitive. Now, if you read with me Romans chapter 6, verse 5, Paul talks about this definitive change, this climactic once for all change. And in verse 5, in the summary of this is what he says in Romans. For if we have been united with him in his death, and a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like this. Now, Paul in Romans is basically preempting a question because these new Christians are saying, if I have forgiveness, can't I just keep on sinning? Why do I have to change? I could keep living on selfishly because I'll always get forgiveness. And Paul in Romans 6 begins this theological treatise to say, actually, that's a wrong way to think because you are a new creation. You have been broken with the powers of death and Satan and sin. You have been united with Jesus in his death. You have been united with Jesus in his resurrection. You have a once-for-all climactic heavenly break with the power of sin and death over you. You are completely changed as a child of God. You can no longer live in the same way that you did before because you are no longer the same person as you once were before. You are no longer a child of Satan and children of wrath, according to Ephesians 2, but you are now the sons of God, adopted and cleansed by the blood and the righteousness of Jesus. Jesus, who, as a revelation of God, reveals holiness to you with crystal clarity of what an absolute morality looks like, but Jesus in his death and in his love and grace on the cross gives you the warmth of the Son, S-U-N, so that you could find wholeness, reassurance, and forgiveness, so that you no longer have to do what you continually do in your sin, but you could have a progressive and definitive change in your life, just like the brothers did. Or as what one poem has said it this way, the author is unknown, but this is what it says. "'Tis not enough to say I'm sorry and repent, and then go on from day to day just living as we went. Repentance is to leave the sins we loved before and show that we did earnest grieve by doing them no more. For we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall be certainly united with him in a resurrection like his. Death and sin no longer reign over you because you have been completely changed and transformed in the image of Jesus Christ. So our application is not to look to Joseph in Genesis 42, but it's to look to Jesus Christ in the New Testament, to set your eyes and heart upon the author and perfecter of your life, the true and better Joseph, the new and consummate Joseph, the one who did something that Joseph always failed to do because he lived the perfect life. And you look at the power of the Son, S-O-N, and you receive the power of his Spirit that breaks the power of sin and death over you. And you live in light of the resurrection of Jesus Christ because you have been united with him in his resurrection. Let us turn to the Lord in prayer.